Good morning. Good to see everybody here this morning. If you will turn to Luke chapter 23, we'll be picking up in our study through the New Testament there as we come close to the end of the book of Luke. And not only to the end of the book of Luke, but also to the end of Jesus' ministry on the earth. So we just probably have a few more weeks left in the study of Luke, and then we're going to do a series on elders. There's been some interest on elders and eldership, and so we're going to get into the organization of the church, and then also the significance of elders and what's all involved in that. I'll probably like to spend a Sunday or two on that, and then we'll get into the Gospel of John, hopefully by July. But for now, we're in Luke chapter 23, and we see that Jesus is now being put on trial. Last week we saw him stand before Annas. We saw him also go before the Sanhedrin. And basically the charge that they brought against Jesus that they felt justified them bringing him or convicting him and condemning him to death was blasphemy. He not only professed to be the Messiah, but also the Son of God. And so for the Jewish religious leaders, that was blasphemy. To them, that was enough to bring him before Pilate and to have him convicted towards death. The false witnesses that they brought didn't really bring any great results. And so they have Jesus himself saying he's the Son of God. So they're going to bring him before Pilate. So this all happened at night. He was arrested the night before. He's brought before Annas and the Sanhedrin at night, but now it's beginning to become daybreak, and he's going to be brought before Pilate. It says in verse 1, then the whole body of them got up and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation and forbidding taxes to pay Caesar, or to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ the King. So Pilate asked him, saying, are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, it is as you say. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. But they kept on insisting, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place. And so an interesting thing that you can see as Jesus goes through these various trials is the many responses that he gets. There is no just one response to Jesus. Here we see as he stands before the Sanhedrin and Annas, and now as they're bringing him to Pilate, great animosity, and they're very hateful and spiteful. This is all being brought out through their jealousy and envy of Jesus and the success of his ministry, and they're just ruthless here with Jesus. They are wanting to have him put to death. And we as people, as human beings, part of God's creation, we too have to make decisions about Jesus. Here he's going to go before not only Pilate, he's going to go before Herod, and we're going to see the crowd with all these different responses, and Jesus standing before these people, and they having to make a decision about Jesus. We'll all have to, within ourselves, recognize the fact that we too have to make a decision about Jesus. And one of the decisions that people often make about Jesus is that of antagonism, hostility towards Jesus. To them, the idea of Jesus, the idea of everything that Jesus stands for is very repulsive and maybe even blasphemous. You mean there's a man who proclaimed that he is the only way to the Father? John chapter 14, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. That's very offensive. And a lot of people will take a lot of offense to a teaching like that. Many other things in connection to the morality that Jesus taught, the ideas that Jesus gave, what he proclaimed to be, brings hostility. And we should never be surprised if, as we go out and we live a life of faith and we're being forthright with our belief system and what we believe, that there might be some hostility thrown against us. And so one of the responses that people have as Jesus is brought before them, as they have to make a decision about him, is that of hostility. Pilate said in verse 6, he says, when Pilate heard it and asked whether the man was a Galilean, and when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was in Jerusalem at the time. So the Jewish people had brought these several accusations against Jesus. They said that he was basically causing problems within their own nation. He was telling people not to pay taxes, which was a complete lie. In chapter 20, they brought that question to him, and he said, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Basically, pay your taxes. But they said, no, he's saying don't pay the taxes. He's also proclaiming himself to be king. So these are the various accusations that are brought against him in this hostile situation. But in the midst of these accusations, they mentioned that he was causing problems in Galilee. And Galilee was an interesting place. It was a place where if there was going to be an insurrection, if there was going to be any uprising or anything, it would happen in Galilee. Those people in the north, they were very opinionated. They had a lot of mixture of ideas. They were up in the north where there was a lot of commerce and a lot of trading going on. So they came into contact with a lot of different ideas, political ideas, religious ideas. And so it's a very hostile place to begin with. And so when Pilate hears that he's from Galilee, that in and of itself might be an accusation against Jesus. But Pilate sees it as a way to get out of this. He says, okay, so he's from Galilee. Is he from Galilee? And they say yes. And so he brings him to Herod, recognizing that Herod had jurisdiction over that northern area. Now, when we come to Herod and what happens with Herod, we also see many other responses that people have with Jesus. It says in verse 8, now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. And he questioned him at some length, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there, accusing him vehemently. And Herod and his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. So here you have another type of response. So not everybody's going to be hostile when they hear about Jesus or have Jesus brought before them and a decision has to be made. It could be that they're very glad. Herod was glad to see Jesus, which seems like a positive thing at the beginning. Yeah, it's good for people to be glad to see Jesus. And sometimes when you're sharing your faith, when you're sharing the story of Jesus, people will be glad to hear it. It'll just warm their heart, give them a warm fuzzy, and they'll just feel very good and glad about hearing about Jesus. But it's not so much that Herod was glad because, I'm glad to see Jesus because I've come to believe some true things about him, and I want to submit my life to him, and I feel like he is the way to the Father. He is the way that he is the one that we've been looking for, and I want to see him because I want to follow him. That wasn't why he was glad. As you continue to read, it says, for he wanted to see him for a long time because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. Yeah, he was glad to see Jesus, and he wanted to see Jesus, but it was purely for the sake of being entertained by Jesus. He just wanted to see a sign by Jesus. He wanted to be entertained, maybe like you might want to see a famous magician or a famous musician or something like that. He had heard a lot about Jesus. Jesus' ministry was very popular, especially in Galilee, where Herod was from, where his jurisdiction was. And so he just wanted to see some miracle. And sometimes, as Christ is presented to individuals, and we could even look at ourselves, right? How do we respond to Jesus? Do we just simply enjoy being a Christian or want to be connected to the church simply to be entertained? We're glad to hear about Jesus because, it entertains us, it makes us feel good, that sort of thing. It's very easy for worship, even coming together as a church, to merely be a talent show, to be a performance in which everyone just becomes entertained. They get a good feeling in their heart, but there's no real commitment to Christ. They're not there to be out of love and commitment and devotion to Christ and a real desire to want to be connected to Christ and fellowship with Christ. And of course, we can't judge other people's hearts. We shouldn't look at others and say, well, they're just there for that, or they're just there for that. But we can look at our own hearts and see, why are we coming to worship? Why is it that we are wanting to stay connected to Christ? Is it merely for a good feeling? Is it merely just to be entertained? Or have we seen him to be the Christ, the Son of the living God, the one that is the creator of all things, the one that we submit ourselves to, we love because he first loved us, and he has become the means by which we can have contact with the living God? Do we come together as a body of believers because we have unity in Christ, because we have the life of Christ within us, and we're able to connect to one another in that unity and to love one another and to love Christ above everything else? Yes, let's be glad to see Jesus. Let's be glad to worship Jesus. Let's be glad to be in the presence of Christ, but for the right reasons. Because he is to be exalted, because he is the focus, because he's the one who is worthy to receive our worship. Now, if we are, as a side result, entertained, or we have a good time and things like that, that's fine. But the ultimate purpose is to focus on Christ and to exalt him above everything else, even our own emotional states. But then also, some people will have Christ presented to them, and they just simply want to mock. That's what the soldiers did here. Starting in verse 10, it says, and the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing him vehemently. Going back to this idea of hostility. But it continues on in verse 11, and Herod with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. So here's another response that people might have with Jesus. It's just a big joke. They think it's just funny. There's been several movies and TV shows that make a mockery of Christianity or make a mockery of Jesus, even Jesus himself. And they don't really take very seriously the things that Jesus claims about himself and claims about reality of life itself. And they think it's just funny. They just think it's a joke. And if you try to share Christ with them, they'll just laugh it off, maybe even make fun of it, that sort of thing. Not recognizing the severity of the situation, the seriousness of the situation, that what we do with Christ is very, very serious. It's not something that we can just laugh off or laugh away. It has great implications for our life, not only in this life, but also for eternity. And so it's a very serious subject when people are discussing things about Jesus, but sometimes it can just become a big joke and a big humorous thing, which of course should never be. And then lastly, implied by this, or not lastly, but also connected to this, is just indifference. That's the other thing that you see. It's more implied than explicitly mentioned. But, Herod has Jesus come in. He's glad to see him. He wants to see some miracle. The soldiers laugh it off. Sometimes it's just indifference. Sometimes when you're sharing the gospel, or even we ourselves can become indifferent to Jesus altogether. Doesn't really make us angry. Doesn't really make us happy. We just kind of indifferent. Or maybe we just ignore the truth claims made by Jesus. And so we just carry on our lives, not even really paying attention to who Jesus is, not even thinking about Christ, just staying in a state of indifference. And again, even we as Christians can do that. As each and every day we live our lives, not thinking about Christ. He's far away from our minds. We got too many more pressing matters to deal with. We're dealing with our job or our families and things like that. Not that those aren't important, but those things kind of take over our whole state of mind, to where Jesus is way off over there. Jesus is for Sunday morning, not for Monday morning. Monday morning is when I get back to life. Jesus should be in all of our lives. We should never have indifference towards Christ. There is really no indifference to Christ. Either you're fully embracing Christ and walking in fellowship with him, loving him, adoring him, worshiping him each and every day, every moment, or you're walking further away from him. It's much like you ever go on the escalators in the mall or something like that. You got to be moving in some direction, especially if you're going up. You're either going to be going up or you're going to be going down. When we're in the spiritual life, we're either moving up or we're moving down. There is no sitting still. And so we should not be indifferent towards Christ. But that could be true of anyone, whether they are a believer or not a believer. Anyone can fall susceptible to indifference towards Christ. Then we pick up in verse 13. Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, "You brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. Nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us, and behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. Therefore I will punish him and release him." Now he was obliged to release to them at the feast one prisoner. So here the innocence of Christ is brought out. Really, only the Sanhedrin were the only ones that were really finding an issue with Christ. Herod kind of laughed it off, didn't even take it all that seriously. Pilate did take it seriously, but still didn't see anything really worthy of death of Christ. And so the innocence of Christ is brought out, which would have been very significant for Luke. Some people suggest that both Volume 1 and Volume 2, as we talked about, the Gospel of Luke and then also the Gospel of Acts, was written to, of course, a guy by the name of Theophilus, but perhaps someone who was connected to Caesar in some way. Remember, the book of Acts ends with Paul in prison in Rome. So some believe that Luke wrote these 2 volumes to give to Theophilus because Paul was about to stand before Caesar. He hadn't done it quite yet at the end of Acts, and that's why there's that abrupt end to the book of Acts. And so they see that as Luke really writing basically a defense for Paul's ministry. And so that traces all the way back to Jesus. And by showing that Jesus was innocent, Paul would have believed in this Jesus, who wasn't an insurrectionist, wasn't a person who was against Rome or anything like that, but was following this man who was innocent. It would have put Paul more in a favorable light there before Caesar and before Theophilus. Of course, that's speculation. We don't know exactly who Theophilus was or why Luke wrote these 2 volumes, but that's one of the things that's been postulated. So that's why Jesus' innocence would have been very much emphasized in the Gospel of Luke. He's an innocent man. Time and time again, he's shown to be innocent in this particular account. But in verse 18 it says, "But they cried out all together, saying, 'Away with this man and release for us Barabbas. He was the one who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection made in the city and for murder.'" So here we come to another response that people often have. So it was a custom for Pilate there on the day of the feast to release a prisoner. Any prisoner they wanted, he would release them. And here he has 2 that he presents to them. Do you want to release Jesus, or do you want to release Barabbas? Now, the people knew who Barabbas was. He was kind of like the Jeffrey Dahmer of his day. He was a very popular murderer, insurrectionist, just a troublemaker. Everyone would have known who Barabbas was. Well, here's Jesus, who had taught them for 3.5 years, who had spoken words of truth and love to them, had healed their sickness and their diseases, and had really just manifested God to them for these 3.5 years and labored this ministry of love to them. And who did they choose? They chose Barabbas, the murderer and insurrectionist. The crowd made or put something of a lesser value over Christ, who is of the greatest value. And this is what is spoken about in Romans chapter 1. In Romans chapter 1, here Paul is speaking about a downward spiral that had happened. It's believed to be more focused towards the Gentiles in chapter 1, since chapter 2 focuses more on the Jewish people. But nonetheless, he describes the people who should have known about the truth about God. Nature manifests the glory of God, his divine attributes, his creativity, his intelligence, his power. There's a lot of things you can learn about God just by observing nature. Just how intricate it is and how wonderful it is, how beautiful it is. You can definitely see a creator behind that, right? Just as you would see a creator behind a grandfather clock or a watch or something like that. When you see design in the way that we see it in the universe, it points towards a creator, right? But what Paul describes is that instead of accepting that, they suppress the truth in unrighteousness, and they make this exchange between God and the created realm. It says in verse 23 of Romans 1, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. And then in verse 25 it says, for they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. And that's exactly what you have with Barabbas and Jesus. You have the creature, who is Barabbas, who was a very malicious creature, I might add. But then you have the Creator, Jesus Christ. In John chapter 1, we're told that nothing in this whole cosmos that was created was not created. There was nothing that was not created by him. That he is the creator of all things. God the Father created all things through Jesus Christ. And that he is therefore the creator, right? The one who created all things. So you have the creature versus the creator. A choice had to be made between Barabbas and Jesus, and the people chose Barabbas. And that's oftentimes the response, and sometimes the response that either non-believers or even Christians sometimes can have. When it comes down to a choice that we have between Barabbas, that is, the things of this world, the things that come from this earth, our own ambitions, our own dreams, our own way of looking at things, or the way of Christ, the way of the Creator, the one who actually brought us into being. Whenever that choice comes up, we have to decide, am I going to choose Jesus and have him released to me and brought to me so I can have a relationship with him? Or am I going to want the things of the world, the things of this earth released to me and me enjoy those things? Which is the better deal? Which is the better thing to have? Had Jesus been released to the crowd, guess what? Jesus could have just continued on ministering to them, loving them, healing their diseases, preaching to them, showing them the way of truth, and helping them out. But now they have this insurrectionist released to them, who we don't know the rest of the story with Barabbas, but who knows what other things may have happened in his life after he was released. But either way, it was the lesser of the two. And same thing is true with us. The choice that we make will have effects in our lives and even have effects to eternity. Which one are we going to choose? Sometimes after choosing Christ, obviously, he does care for us and provide for us. And sometimes he does bless us with earthly things, right? And we can enjoy those things to his glory. But it's all about the emphasis of our lives. Who has the supremacy in our lives? The Creator or the created? That's the choice that we have to make. Unfortunately, the crowd chose the creature. They chose Barabbas. And then it continues on in verse 22, and he said to them the third time, why? What evil has this man done? Notice the emphasis on his innocence. I have found in him no guilt demanding death, therefore I will punish him and release him. But they were insistent with loud voices, asking he to be crucified, or he be crucified. And their voices began to rebel. And Pilate pronounced a sentence that their demand be granted. And he released the man they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, but delivered Jesus to their will. Also notice the emphasis by Luke on Barabbas' condition. This is twice that he says for insurrection and for murder. Like, this is the guy that they're asking for, emphasizing who it is exactly they're asking for. But Pilate gives in to the crowd. So this becomes our next response. And that is, it may not be that out of an antagonistic attitude or hostility we choose the creature rather than the creator, like the crowd did here. It might be because of the pressure of the people around us. Pilate had some pretty bad relationship with the Jewish people. He had done some things that almost got him in trouble with Caesar. Several things that he did. And so there was already a little bit of hostility between him and them. And he was already kind of doing good not to have been reported to Caesar for some of the things that he did against the Jewish people. For one, just blatantly letting the soldiers march through Jerusalem with their standard with the symbol of Caesar on it, which was very offensive to the Jews. Previous governors wouldn't do that. They didn't want to offend the Jews, but Pilate didn't care, and that caused a lot of problems. There's other things that he did, but because he was in such a political predicament, and because he knew that he was kind of walking the fine line there, he gave in to the crowd and said, okay, you can have Jesus, or you can crucify Jesus. And sometimes that can be what happens to a lot of people. Influenced by the crowd, influenced by their friends, influenced by their family, influenced by other people who have a lot of pull with them. And the decision to follow Jesus becomes very, very difficult. This would have taken a lot of courage by Pilate to say, no, he's an innocent man. I know all you guys are crying, crucify him. I know this may cause a lot of a big insurrection and a big revolt, but still, he's an innocent man, and I'm going to deal with him as an innocent man. This would take a lot of courage, and it takes a lot of courage for us sometimes to not go with the crowd, to not go with what our coworkers are telling us, or the way that our coworkers are influencing us, or our family members, or other people, and to say, no, Jesus is the real deal, and I'm going to follow him no matter what the crowd is shouting. Even if the crowd is shouting, crucify, I'm going to hold fast to Christ, and I'm going to put him first above the voices that I hear around me. When Christ is presented before us, that's another decision that we have to make. Follow the crowd or follow Jesus. Receive Jesus for who he truly is, or ignore what he truly is for the sake of the crowd. Again, the wrong decisions made here, but we don't have to follow that example, but we can learn from the example and go another way. But then we have presented before us the last response, and this is a good response that we should have, and it has to do with Simon of Cyrene. It says in verse 26, when they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, coming in from the country, and placed on him the cross to carry behind Jesus. We mentioned several times, right, that the disciples, the apostles, they had an opportunity to follow what Jesus had taught them about denying themselves, taking up their cross and following him, to physically be able to do that, like literally be able to follow Jesus to the cross, to take up their own cross, probably given to them by Rome, by Pilate perhaps, and follow Jesus to Golgotha and die with him there on a cross. They could have literally, physically done it at that opportunity. But what did they do? They all scattered. They went away, right? It's interesting that Simon of Cyrene is the only one who took up the cross and followed Jesus. Now, whether he was doing this out of faith or because he was, it seems to be out of compulsion, they forced him to do it, but still, the very act gives us something to reflect on. And it's not one of the 12 apostles. As far as we know, he's not a part of the 70 disciples that Jesus sent out, nor is he a Jew. He's from Cyrene. And Cyrene was northern Africa, okay? So he's not even from the promised land. We assume he's not a Jew. There's no real evidence to say that he was even a proselyte, that is, someone who converted to Judaism, a Gentile converted to Judaism. He's just a man who was coming in out of the fields. He was just a man kind of minding his own business. And the next thing he knows, he's taking up the cross and he's following Jesus to Golgotha. There's a lot of irony there, and I think a lot of significance there as well. And he gives us a good example. Again, whether this was out of compulsion or because they were forcing him to, or because, he wanted to. The fact that he's following Christ, taking up the cross and following Christ is an example for us of what we should do. It might be in our lives, we've just, for a long time, just been minding our own business. We've been out in the fields, maybe working, laboring, trying to earn a living, trying to do our own thing, trying to do what we can to get by in life, just to survive, perhaps. And then someone comes up to us and says, hey, here's the cross of Christ. Put it on your shoulders and follow him to the cross. Follow him to Golgotha. And then, for us, a choice has to be made. Will we take up our cross and follow him? And we, as believers, as Christians, we of all people should be taking up our cross every day and following Christ. Much like the apostles should have been taking up their cross and following Christ. But are we doing it? Or do we remain out in the fields? We remain out in the world, doing our own thing. At some point in our lives, we've got to hear the words, hey, take this cross and follow Jesus down the path to crucifixion. That is the path of self-denial, saying I'm not going to live for myself anymore. I'm not going to be self-ambitious. I'm not going to be self-centered. I'm not going to be self-preservation or be involved in self-preservation and just doing whatever I can to get by for myself and make myself happy. And as we mentioned before, when we live that life of self-denial, when we take up the cross, that's the happiest in the place in the world to be. It's the opposite of what we think, but it is. When we give ourselves wholly to Christ, we get to live in the presence of Christ. We get to have Christ abiding in us abiding in Christ. We're connected to Christ because we're committed to Christ. We submitted to Christ, and so he's living through us, with us, and for us. And we're getting to follow him and be close to him, in close relationship with him. We have the promise of eternity, of resurrection, the promise of eternal life, eternal glory, eternal bliss, and even get a foretaste of that in this present day. We have the Holy Spirit who seals us, who gives us the guarantee of our inheritance. We have God with us everywhere that we go. So what if there's a few bumps in the road? What if the cross is heavy? What if the path is difficult? We've got Jesus. What more does a person need? What more can fulfill a person? What more could bring a person happiness and joy? And to be in Jesus' presence. I say out of all the crowd, Pilate, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish crowd, just passerbyers who were just watching things at a distance, the women that we'll see here in a moment, out of all the people and all the crowd, the most blessed person there was Simon of Cyrene. Because he got to taste a little bit of the experience of Christ. Paul said, you know what, I consider all things as rubbish, as filth, compared to knowing Christ. He says, you know what, I'm willing to count all things as loss for the sake of Christ. To know Christ, I'd be willing to give up everything else and to taste in his suffering so that I might also participate in the resurrection. Paul said that was the greatest deal. And it's the greatest deal for us as well. And so here, Simon of Cyrene gives us a great example. And then we'll conclude with verses 27 through 32, where we see the real reason why we should follow Jesus in this way. It says, in following him was a large crowd of the people and of women who were mourning and lamenting him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. And they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? Two others also who were criminals were being led away to be put to death with him. All right, so now we have this crowd of people who are mourning. And scholars are kind of back and forth whether these were professional mourners like you'd have at a funeral. Back then they would actually hire people to come and mourn. They would actually get paid to mourn at a person's funeral. But most likely these are not professional mourners. These people were probably genuinely weeping over Jesus, seeing him just mangled because of the scourging that he had, just bleeding. Those who've seen the Passion of Christ can get an idea of what that would have looked like. And to see him just barely being able to walk, but having to walk that pathway to the cross, they were just weeping and lamenting over that. But Jesus said, you know what, something worse is even coming for you as a community of people. He says, you know, don't weep for me. You got some hard days coming because of this. And here he's alluding to, once again, remember Luke's focus on the temple, right? He's alluding to the fact that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, that Rome is going to destroy Jerusalem. So the Rome that is putting Jesus on the cross is the same Rome that's going to destroy their very city and bring it to ruin. And so he's saying, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves. You got some hard times coming. There's going to be a time when people are going to say, you know, it'd be better not even to have a baby, to have not the burden of having children, having to escape, taking care of children. They're going to want the mountains to cover them and fall on them just to keep them from the great terror that was about to come upon them through this invasion of the Roman government. And he says, for if they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is day? And this is a proverbial statement, but it basically means if they're doing this to an innocent person, to me, who haven't done anything wrong, who hasn't been an insurrectionist or tried to rally people against the Roman government, what do you think is going to happen when this revolt does take place in AD 68, when the Jews do begin to revolt? If they're doing this to an innocent person, just think what they're going to do to guilty people who are truly revolting against Rome, who are truly saying don't pay taxes to Caesar, who are truly saying that we want another government besides Rome. You just think it's bad now. Weep for yourselves. You got hard times coming. And so that impresses on our hearts too, that the way that we respond to Christ and the way that what we do with Christ as he's presented before us has great implications on the future. There is a day coming in which not just Jerusalem will be destroyed, but all the earth, the whole world will be destroyed. In 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter reminds us of that, and he likens it to the time of Noah when the earth was flooded. He says, well, the promise was that God was never going to flood the earth again, but God didn't say anything about fire. And the last destruction is going to be more than the first, as even the elements of the earth, even the elements of the cosmos will be burned up. And so he says there in 2 Peter chapter 3, he says in verse 8, but do not let this one fact escape your notice, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like 1 day. Some people might say, well, it's been 2,000 years since Jesus came. Where's the destruction? Where's the end of the world? Well, in verse 9, the Lord is not slow about his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you. It's because of his patience that hasn't happened yet. Not wishing for any to perish, but for all to come to repentance. As much as God would want to send his son and usher in the new heavens and new earth, he's holding back because he wants more and more people to come to repentance. He wants a relationship with more and more people. It's because of patience that hadn't happened yet. But in verse 10 it says, but the day of the Lord will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up. By the way, scientists even say that they have basically, even scientists have their own eschatology, that is a study of the end. And they say they're basically going to be either two events. Either the sun is going to explode and burn up the earth and everything in our universe, or there's going to be this heat death. Entropy and things like that. The law of thermodynamics says that eventually the universe has got to wind down and come to an end, right? Either way, the end will come of the universe. But here, this is seen more as a miraculous thing, a thing in which God actually steps in and causes the end. And in doing so, everything was going to be burned up. He says in verse 11, since all these things are to be destroyed in this way, what sort of people ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be destroyed by burning, and the elements will melt with intense heat. But according to his promise, we are looking for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. The end is coming. They needed to connect to Christ. They needed to listen to Christ and obey Christ to be saved from the destruction of Jerusalem, because Jesus predicted it was going to happen. He told them the way to not be destroyed with that. We too need to follow Christ because he gives us instructions on how to avoid the destruction that's coming over the whole universe, the whole cosmos. He's saying through Jesus Christ, we will pass through that to the other side and be able to inhabit and enjoy the new heavens and new earth that's coming, where there's none of this sickness and dying and crying and heartache and depression and everything that goes along with this created world as it is now. One in which there's bliss, where there's new life, where we be able to eat from the tree of life and live forever, to have new bodies, glorious bodies that don't get sick, that don't get cancer, that don't get coronavirus or whatever it is, but are healthy bodies, strong bodies, powerful bodies that will never, ever perish. But it all traces back to a decision today. Who are we going to follow? What What are we going to value? Jesus is presented to us today. He's standing before us as though he was standing, or as he was standing before those people in trial. And we have to make a verdict. We have to make a decision about Jesus. What to do with this man who claimed to be the Son of God, the man who claimed to be the Messiah. What are we going to do with this man? Are we going to get hostile and mad? Are we going to just want to be entertained by him? Want to maybe know a little bit of things about him and then move on? Are we going to mock him? Are we going to joke about the things in connection to him? Are we just going to be indifferent and say, well, it doesn't really matter. Let me get on with my life? Are we going to decide other things over him? Are we going to choose the creature over the creator? Are we going to follow the crowd? What the voices are telling us all around us, our friends, our coworkers, perhaps even our family members? Or are we going to say, you know what? I've come out of the fields. I've heard the message of the cross. And you know what? I want to take up a cross. And I want to bear that cross with Jesus. And I want to follow Jesus all the way to the end. Because I know a day is coming when destruction is coming. And I'm looking past that towards the great blessings that God has prepared for me. If for this short amount of time, I'll just take up my cross and follow Jesus. What decision are we going to make today? Are we going to choose the creator over the creature, or vice versa? What are we going to do with Jesus? And that's a question not only for non-Christians, but even Christians themselves. What are we going to do with Jesus? How are we going to go through this upcoming week? With our eyes fixed on Christ? With our minds set on the things above, not on the things of the earth? Recognizing that our citizenship is in heaven? That we're seated at the right hand in the heavenlies with Christ? Or just living a low life? Just living a life connected to this world? What choice are we going to make? If you're here this morning and you haven't committed your life to Christ, we definitely open the invitation to you now to do so. And to make that great decision, to choose Christ over Barabbas. To choose Christ. To choose life over death. To choose eternity over this temporal life. If you want to do that this morning, please come forward as we stand and sing the song that Dylan has prepared.